Lily is an author, freelancer, and world traveler who has been to all 7 continents and has a seasonal home in Mexico. Oh boy. She is currently writing a book on responsible travel. Lily has earned the certificate in sustainability and anti-oppression in travel from the Rise Travel Institute. The certificate program takes a systems thinking approach to address the intersection of social justice, community development, animal protection, and environmental sustainability in the context of travel. She's traveling with the Rise Travel Institute to Guatemala to further study these topics, and will share photos and takeaways with Oasis in a travelogue on today. So her talk is going to address broad aspects of sustainable travel and she'll share a few practical tips we can use the next time we go abroad. When she's not gallivanting to foreign countries, Lily spends most of the year living in a motorhome with her husband Keith and their cat Sprite in various states around the US. They are currently living in Minnesota. So welcome, Lily. Oh, I'm so excited about this topic. Yeah, tell us all about it.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see this screen and hear me? Excellent. Hello, everyone. My name is Liliane Fouts, as Genevieve said. It's good to be back at Oasis again. It's been a really long time. So even if it's virtually, nice to see a few familiar faces here. Earlier this month, I traveled to Guatemala, and I'd love to share a few of my experiences with you. This trip was organized by the Rise Travel Institute for students who had completed their Flagship certificate program, which explores different aspects of sustainable travel. RISE stands for responsible, impactful, sustainable, and ethical. And I'm happy to see, just as a side note, the founder of RISE is with us today, Vinci. Hi, Vinci, good to see you on the call. I've been planning to write a book about responsible travel for some time, and when I came across this course, it just seemed like the perfect opportunity to educate myself more on the topic and connect with other like-minded travelers. So I signed up right away, and I learned so much in the course, and then all of that learning just came to life in this trip. RISE partnered with Étnica Travel, which is a Guatemala-owned and operated travel company, and they organized all the details of the trip. So, quick overview. We flew into Guatemala City and spent 1 to 3 days each around Antigua, Lake Atitlan, Chichicastenango, and Tikal. Antigua is a colorful town not far from the capital, Guatemala City. It's filled with just old colonial buildings and scenic streets, and it has views of surrounding volcanoes, one of which is active. The beautiful Lake Atitlan is surrounded by villages with plenty of interesting history and culture. We stayed in an eco hotel in San Juan La Laguna on the shore of this lake and explored several of the towns around the lake. Chichicastenango is in the highlands with cooler weather and Central America's largest market. This is just one tiny little piece of this market, which extends for many blocks in various directions. And Tikal, up in the northern part of Guatemala, is much warmer, and it's the site of the famous Mayan ruins. You can see the tops of these ruins poking out above the jungle. And watching the sunset here was just amazing. Do you ever give much thought to where your morning cup of coffee comes from? Our first activity of the trip in the Antigua area was a coffee farm tour hosted by Froilan, a farmer from a cooperative called De la Gente, which means from the people. Because the aim of this enterprise is to get the coffee from these small farmers to customers around the world. And this organization supports small-scale coffee farmers in a wide range of ways, from loans to marketing to mental health programs. Guatemala was in a civil war from 1960 to 1996, and many people, particularly the indigenous people, suffer from mental health issues such as PTSD and low self-esteem as a result of this traumatic experience. And De La Gente is taking a holistic approach by helping these farmers not only gain business and earn a fair income for their work, but also to value their own hard work. Froilan showed us the whole process of the coffee business from seed to cup. The coffee plants in this section of the field are a year old, and Froilan explained that the first couple of years of a coffee plant's life are critical. The field has to be kept very clean, free of weeds, in order to allow the coffee plants to get enough water so that they can thrive. Farmers also plant trees in the field to provide the right amount of shade for the coffee plants. And if you look carefully at the mountain behind these coffee plants, you'll notice that it's an active volcano. It's not something you see every day in Kansas and Missouri. Here's a closer look. It takes a coffee plant about 5 years to begin producing enough beans for the farmer to make a profit. This is why De La Gente provides interest-free loans to their farmers so they don't need to start paying them back until after the first 5 years. And a coffee plant can live about 80 years. So once the plants are established, it can be a really good crop to have. Once the coffee cherries turn red, the harvest begins. During the harvest, the workers will pick about 100 to 150 pounds of coffee cherries per person, carry them down, and these need to be processed immediately so they don't ferment and create sour tasting coffee. So they begin by feeding the coffee cherries in through a hand cranked machine that strips the outer red pulp from the coffee beans. And then they place them in big containers for 36 hours for anaerobic fermentation, which removes the mucus from the coffee beans. And then they wash the beans twice to remove all the debris. And then they put these beans into large trays and move them out into the sun to dry. They have to stir the beans on these large trays 3 times a day so that they dry evenly. And then after 7 to 10 days, they're ready for the next step. You'll notice in this picture, the beans are different colors in the 2 bowls. The beans in the top bowl still have a husk on them, and the ones in the bottom bowl have been husked. So they do this with another machine. The farmers all share the machine, which is provided by De La Gente. Here you can see the husk and the bean separated. After all the husks have been stripped off the beans, they then sort the beans by size. If you roast the beans of different sizes together, they won't roast evenly. They sort the beans again. After that, they pull out bad ones. The premium coffee has to have fewer than 5% of misshapen or missized or discolored beans in the batch. And then at this point, the beans are ready for roasting. The farmers, some of the farmers ship the beans green to their customers who roast their own beans, and sometimes they buy the beans already roasted from the farmers. This is the farmer's wife here, and in our case, for our tour here, we roasted our own beans over this fire in a clay pan. And then we ground the beans by hand on a metate, which is a stone tool that's also used to grind corn and cacao beans. And finally, the woman boiled the ground coffee in a pot of water and strained it into a teapot. And we celebrated the end of the coffee tour with a fresh, hot cup of coffee. You can learn a little bit more about De La Gente and order coffee from them if you want to. They have a website, dlgcoffee.org. But next time you have a cup of coffee, remember the hard work that goes into making it. The coffee industry is notorious for exploiting farmers and workers, and fair trade coffee allows farmers like Froilan and his family to have a good home and access to education and other opportunities. So keep that in mind when you're purchasing your coffee. We also learned a lot about Guatemalan traditions and culture through the rich craft of textiles. Notice how the woman in this video clip is using what looks like a short knitting needle to move the threads into place one by one. Traditionally, the indigenous people have worn beautiful hand-woven outfits made from textiles, which tell their stories and beliefs in the patterns of the fabric. During the Civil War, many of these people, especially the men, were severely persecuted and tortured, even killed. And as a result, the indigenous men very rarely wear these traditional outfits anymore. The first textile place we visited was the Chocohol Huyu weaving school. Chocohol Huyu is the Maya Cachiquel language, and it means surrounded by mountains. And it's in San Antonio, Aguascalientes, near Antigua, and it is indeed surrounded by mountains. The people in this community are the only ones in Guatemala who weave using a special technique that shows the pattern on both sides of the fabric. And each piece can take weeks or months to complete, depending on the size. This weaving school was founded by these three ladies. They were very impressed with the size of Zach, the 6'3" guy in our group, and they wanted their picture taken with him. And the indigenous clothes that they dressed him up with barely fit him. But the school these ladies founded pairs grandparents with children. So they have this goal of passing that knowledge along from the elders to the new generation. The program has been really successful so far. A lot of the kids are super excited about it and doing really well. This lady is demonstrating a piece that is 60 or 70 years old. It still looks like new. They pass these pieces down from one generation to the next. The patterns in the fabric each pattern represents something in their Mayan culture. As they weave their textiles, they pass along their knowledge and their stories and their traditions through the symbolism that is in every pattern in the fabric. One of the big problems that they've had in recent years is Chinese companies that come in, they steal their designs, and they make cheap knockoffs. So the indigenous people call these knockoffs disposable because they fall apart after a few washes, unlike these genuine hand-woven pieces that last for decades. But obviously these knockoffs can be sold far cheaper than the genuine items, and it's a real threat to their business and their whole culture. Another indigenous cooperative we visited in San Antonio was Manos de Fe, or Hands of Faith, consisting of over 20 women who are working to preserve their weaving and embroidery techniques and promote community tourism and economic development within their community. Many of the women in this organization host travelers through homestays, which is what our group did that night. Here are a couple of people from our group, Vincy and Thomas. I think they're both in the audience today. Hi, guys. And these ladies selected these members of our group to reenact a courtship tradition and wedding ceremony from their culture. So back when the women still had to go to wells and watering holes to get their water, young men in search of a wife would go watch the women. And if he saw a young woman he liked, he would approach her and try to knock the pot of water off her head. If the woman was interested, she would let the pot fall. And if she wasn't, she would just hang on to that pot for dear life and not let go of it. The young man never spoke to the woman in this process. If she showed interest, then he would have to figure out where she lived and go talk to her father. And then the wedding would last, there was a very elaborate courtship process, lots of traditions, and then a very elaborate wedding as well. And the weddings are still elaborate the last several days. We also made handmade corn tortillas with the women from Manos de Fe. This is an art form as well. Many of us really struggled to make tortillas without dropping dough or having them fall apart on the griddle. Mine were always misshapen and fell apart. But we cooked the tortillas over a fire on the clay griddle, similar to how we had roasted the coffee. And they are delicious. Our group split up into pairs that night. We went to the homes of various women from Manos de Fe for our homestays. My roommate, Davy, and I stayed with Angelina and her husband, Marlon, and their 12-year-old son, Joaquin, and their very cuddly kitty, Tanana, who never left my arms unless I put her down myself. I wish my cat did that. I brought a unique deck of cards for the family as a gift, and Joaquin was having a great time doing magic tricks for us. It was just precious. An interesting side note, Marlon, the father, is a musician in Guatemala's National Marimba Ensemble, and he has traveled all over the world playing with his marimba group. He's also played in Guatemala for some high-profile guests, such as former President George Bush. He's traveled to the US 4 times and would love to bring his family up here for a visit someday. It's tricky because Guatemalans' passports are a lot more restricted than our US passports. So they have to go through a long, lengthy process to come to the US, even as tourists. The next day, we left the Antigua area and traveled to Lake Atitlan. Over the next few days, we visited some more textile cooperatives in the villages around the lake. In Santiago Atitlan, we visited 13 Bats, a group of 20 families that also fight to keep the traditions of their people alive. The Guatemalan highlands, including Lake Atitlan, were particularly affected by the Civil War. And so clothing is, again, a real act of resistance against the eradication of their culture. In this picture, we can see another backstrap loom, similar to the one at the Chocohol Huyu school. These types of looms are traditionally used only by women. The techniques in this area are different from the ones in San Antonio. They pass the threads through rather than using a needle to move the threads like we saw in the video clip. While the women traditionally weave using the backstrap loom, the men weave on these larger pedal-operated looms, and they make much wider fabrics. Embroidery is also a major technique in this area. These elaborate designs can take days or weeks just to draw with a pencil, and then they come back and embroider these designs with their needle and thread. There are a lot of birds in the designs in this region. This is one of the traditional pants the men used to wear. Occasionally, you still see the men wearing something like this, but it's pretty rare. Most of the men are still really traumatized by the Civil War days, and when Indigenous men, were killed, or forced to join the military and perpetuate the military atrocities just for wearing their traditional outfits. So a lot of people are afraid to wear them anymore. I'll share one other cooperative we visited. This one is in another town on the lake called San Juan. That's the town we were actually staying in. This group of weavers make their pieces from absolute scratch, from growing their own cotton to making their thread by hand to dyeing that thread with natural dyes they make themselves from leaves and bark, insects, other natural materials. And these colors are vibrant and they don't bleed. I bought this piece that I'm wearing right now from this cooperative, and the purples and pinks in this come from the Campeche tree, and the blues come from the indigo plant, and there's different hues. The hues of these plants vary according to when they are picked. If they are picked during the full moon, they're darker, and if they're picked during the new moon, they're lighter. So I have a range of colors in this, but it's just from 2 different plants. Here, one of the women is demonstrating how she makes the thread by hand and the process for dyeing the thread in a way that's going to hold its color. And then, of course, after making and coloring the thread, they weave their pieces. Lots of work. I asked if different women specialized in different parts of the process, and they said no. Every woman does every part of the process herself. Here is another local woman-led project that we visited, Pintando Santa Catarina Palopo. Santa Catarina Palopo was a town in decline, and these women wanted to revitalize it. They learned about a project in the favelas of Brazil, where this dilapidated neighborhood was cleaned up and painted and really changed things for them. Crime went down, education went up. So using the model from Brazil, these women put their own Mayan twist on it. And they used a coordinated color palette, Mayan figures inspired by the textiles, locally sourced, locally made non-toxic paint that won't pollute the lake. And they've organized a movement to paint the whole town. With sponsorships from donors, households can sign up to have their homes painted. The homeowners in turn agree to send their kids to school. Historically, education hasn't been much of a priority in this area. So now more kids are getting an education thanks to this project. And here they are demonstrating how they make the paints. The result is this beautiful town. It's painted in coordinating colors using the figures from their culture. Education levels have increased, tourism is way up, and as a result, a lot of businesses are developing in the town. It's giving it a good economic boost. Here's the church in town. It's the only building that doesn't seem to be blue. And here's an aerial shot taken with our photographer's drone. As I mentioned previously, Guatemala had a lengthy civil war. Things are much better now, but it's still fresh in the memories of many Guatemalans. In the town of Santiago Atitlan, this park commemorates a battle that took place on December 2nd, 1990. Each of those memorials marks a spot where someone fell and died. Some of them were just children. The first memorial I looked at had been a 5-year-old. But on that day, December 2nd, 1990, this town rose up and pushed the army out of their town and forbade them from ever coming back. And to this day, the army is only allowed to enter this town to help out in the case of a natural disaster. In Chichicastenango, during our day at the market, Central America's largest market, our guide showed us murals that were there on one of the walls there in the market depicting Guatemala's history. The mural behind him on the left, you can see images of torture, villages being burned. There's a book written by an indigenous woman called I, Rigoberta Menchú, which describes a lot of what happened to the indigenous people around the country, especially in the highlands. If you plan to visit Guatemala, I highly recommend reading that book to learn a little bit about the country's history from the indigenous perspective, even if you're not visiting. It's very interesting information. In the years since the war, as we see the mural on the right, education levels are going up. The indigenous kids are now getting a modern education while also learning the stories and traditions of their elders. And a couple of generations ago, many of these indigenous people did not speak Spanish. They only spoke their native tribal languages. So there are over 20 of these languages in Guatemala. It made it very difficult for them to organize. And they haven't been able to speak up for themselves. Now that they mostly all speak Spanish, they can have a voice and speak up for themselves and organize. In the highlands, the Mayan spirituality is still widely practiced. Some people exclusively practice their Mayan religion, but syncretism is also very common. And that's a mixture of Catholic or evangelical beliefs with the traditional beliefs. Inside this church, which is Catholic, there are little platforms on the floor where people build little fires to conduct their Mayan ceremonies as well. The cemetery in Chichicastenango was another interesting glimpse into the various religious traditions. Mayans bury their dead in the ground, and the Catholics tend to bury their dead in above ground vaults. The colors of the graves also have meanings. For example, the green represents agriculture. So those who worked in some form of agriculture in life were buried in green graves. The blue represents water. So if someone worked as a boat captain or a fisherman or some other water-related career, they are buried in a blue grave. Pink is for the medical field, doctors, nurses, midwives, native healers, etc. We finished our tour of Guatemala by flying up to Flores and spending a couple of days in Tikal National Park. The first day we visited the main part of the park. We saw the most famous temples, we watched the sunset. And then the second day, we went to a part of Tikal visited by far fewer tourists. It's called Huashactún. There are Mayan ruins in Huashactún as well, right next to an indigenous village where the people live in harmony with nature, sustainably harvesting lumber, decorative plants, natural chewing gum, and more. In this picture, our guide is showing us how they harvest natural chewing gum, which comes from this tree's sap. The people in Oaxaca are also preserving their heritage by hanging on to the artifacts that have been recovered from the nearby ruins. They've received many offers from museums and collectors and so forth for these artifacts, but they want to make sure that their heritage is not lost or stolen. You always hear stories of artifacts going to a country and then never going back to where they came from. They are protecting their heritage, so they've registered their artifacts with the Guatemalan Ministry of Culture and kept them right there in Oaxaca. These pieces are hundreds of years old, maybe 1,000 years old. The bowl in the foreground has a Mayan hieroglyphics on it that say chocolate. So this container was used for drinking chocolate by the Mayans way back in the day. We went out and visited the ruins as well, and you can see the masks or faces on the sides of this pyramid. Mayans and many other ancient civilizations were famous for their astronomical observations. And the buildings in this area line up perfectly with the equinoxes and summer and winter solstices. So the sun is directly over the center building on the equinoxes and directly over the other buildings, summer and winter solstices. Of course, a trip would not be complete without a mishap. So on our way out of Oaxaca, we were making our way back to the airport, and we were met by a bus full of people from Oaxaca heading home. We pulled off to the side to let them pass us and became stuck in the mud. So the driver of the bus stopped, and a bunch of men from the community of Oaxaca piled out, and after some pushing and pulling and working together, they've helped free us from the mud, and we were able to get to the airport on time. So here we are celebrating and thanking the men from Oaxaca for their help. It was really lovely to see how the community just rallies around and helps when a need arises. And despite the mishap, this was kind of a high point to end the main part of our trip. I'm going to close with a group photo taken at Tikal and a few practical takeaways from this trip on responsible travel. First, think about how your spending is going to affect the places where you travel. Staying in locally owned hotels and homes, eating in locally owned restaurants, that can be very impactful because most of the money you spend is going to stay in that community. Unlike mass tourism, such as big chain hotels, big chain restaurants, big resorts, where 80 to 95%, depending on the estimate, of your dollars are actually going into the pockets of wealthy businesses in wealthy countries. We stayed in locally owned hotels, eco hotels, and of course the homestay, which was such a unique and rewarding experience. Second, think of the impact of your buying choices. Community tourism, supporting local artisans rather than mass-produced clothes and souvenirs made in China, will not only help the local economy, but also will help them preserve their precious skills and their culture. And lastly, that human connection is so important. I believe that the more effort we make to connect with individuals and places where we travel, the more fun we will have. Most travelers, when looking back on their fondest memories of a trip, they often think back to the connections they made and the people they met along the way. Even if there's a language barrier, we can learn a handful of words and we can share and smile and communicate a lot with gestures. I'm thinking of Vinci, the founder of Rise Travel Institute. She's originally from Hong Kong, and she brought chopsticks as a gift for her host family. And they had so many laughs together as she taught them how to use the chopsticks. So even though she couldn't speak Spanish and they couldn't speak English, they had a great time together. This may sound naive, but I also believe that the more we work to connect with and understand those who are different from ourselves, the more peaceful our world will become. So please, when you travel, try to break out of the little tourist bubble and represent your country well by connecting with the people in your host country. I want to thank you for joining me as I share these memories from my trip. And if you're planning a trip soon, I hope some of what I shared gives you some ideas. So happy travels.